So, something really strange happened when Jesus was being arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane. This is the night that Jesus was put on trial, and the next day he was nailed to the cross. So there's a lot going on. This is a very heavy section of scripture. And there's one detail that's only recorded in one of the four Gospels. Mark 51 and 52 say, "And a young man followed him, with nothing but a linen cloth about his body, and they seized him, but he left the linen cloth and ran away naked." Now, if you're a normal, well-adjusted person, you probably read a strange verse like that, you say, well, that's weird, and then you just move right along with your Bible reading. But the listeners of this podcast are not normal, well-adjusted people, and so let's figure out today what is up with the naked man who shows up in the garden when Jesus was arrested. Because I find it to be weird, and I'd like to explore why it's in the Bible. Turn to Mark 14, and let's get weird. Welcome to Weird Stuff in the Bible, where we explore scripture passages that are bizarre, perplexing, or just plain weird. This is Luke Taylor, and today we're going to be talking about the naked guy who shows up in Mark 14. This episode goes out to Bill in Woodland Park, Colorado. He asked me about this when I was out on vacation there last month, and we had a good time theorizing about it. And so we'll start today, kind of how we always do, by exploring the context around the strange event. And this is a very well-known moment as far as the arrest of Jesus and all this. This is a very well-known moment in the Bible and, honestly, in human history. All four Gospels tell about this. And so Mark 14, we'll start at verse 32. It says, "And they went to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, 'Sit here while I pray.'" And to skip ahead just a bit in the narrative, Jesus would pray and the disciples would fall asleep. And he kept waking them up, but they just didn't realize the importance of the moment they were in. They kept nodding off. And so it picks up here in verse 43. "And immediately, while he was still speaking, Judas came, one of the 12, and with him a crowd with swords and clubs, from the chief priests and the scribes and the elders. Now the betrayer had given them a sign, saying, 'The one I kiss is the man. Seize him and lead him away under guard.' And when he came, he went up to him at once and said, 'Rabbi,' and he kissed him. And they laid hands on him and seized him. But one of those who stood by drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his ear. And Jesus said to them, 'Have you come out as against a robber with swords and clubs to capture me? Day after day I was with you in the temple teaching, and you did not seize me. But let the scriptures be fulfilled.' And they all left him and fled." The they right there being his disciples. And so there's a whole lot we could say about that paragraph of scripture I just read. I want to focus on the main subject for today, though. I read all that to make sure we're on the same page here about the context of this moment, okay? That way the randomness of the next two verses can be properly understood. The next two verses are just so, random is really the best word for it. They're so out of place with everything else going on. My ESV study Bible, it actually puts these two verses in their very own section. They're in a section it's simply called "A Young Man Flees." But as brief as this section is, there's a little bit more to it than just a young man fleeing. Okay, so Mark 14, 51 and 52 again. "And a young man followed him with nothing but a linen cloth about his body, and they seized him, but he left the linen cloth and ran away naked." So there's no elaboration given. There's no follow-up. It just appears out of nowhere. We all get a chance to feel awkward about it for a little while, and then it disappears without any explanation. Kind of like monkeypox. In verse 53, it does nothing to shed any light on any of this. It just says, "And they led Jesus to the high priest, and all the chief priests and the elders and the scribes came together." And it makes no more reference to the naked guy. It just goes on with the main narrative. It talks about the unjust trial and that Jesus had to go through, and you know what happens after that. So what is happening right here in verses 51 and 52? Well, here are some theories. Theory number one, that this is simply a historical detail. Perhaps the Bible simply means exactly what it says it means. And I know whenever we read something in the Bible that's weird, this is often like the last resort. We throw out all the ideas of, what it could mean, why it would say something like that. What does it symbolize, perhaps? What is the Bible telling us by including this? And then a lot of times it's like my fallback is I usually just return to perhaps the Bible just means what it says it means. It's pretty clear, even if it's mysterious as to why this happened. But it's pretty clear there is a man, he was nearly nude, if not for basically a sheet that's wrapped around him. And it says when the disciples scattered and when they abandoned Jesus, the arresting soldiers tried to grab this guy, and he just ran away. He left the sheet in their hands. And it's such an odd detail to everything else going on. Some do try to spiritualize this away and say it's simply symbolic language. New Testament scholar Joel Marcus, in his work on Mark, he considers the young man to be a symbolic representation of the disciples' abandonment and the consequences of following Jesus. He says that nakedness represents shame, and that the Bible describes a man running away naked to describe how pathetic it was, basically, that the disciples would abandon Jesus at such a critical moment. So in other words, he says this detail is so random, it likely did not literally happen. It just merely symbolizes shame. Again, kind of like having monkeypox. Now, it might be symbolic, but I also believe that this literally happened. I don't dismiss that it actually happened just because it's too random or too weird. I don't think the question of whether it literally happened or whether it was symbolism, I don't see that as an either or proposition. You can go back to my episode about the zombies in Matthew 27, and I give some more information about this, that I would say this is a physical reality, perhaps that it could have symbolized an even greater spiritual reality, but it doesn't change the fact that it was also physically, literally did happen. So if it literally happened, if the Bible means what it says it means, then why is it here when it seems so disconnected from everything else going on? It's almost like a distraction. And the reason is that this is an eyewitness account. And anytime you have eyewitness accounts, an eyewitness account is going to include historical details that might seem random and disconnected from the main narrative. Okay? So if you like Bible trivia, I've got some Bible trivia here for you. The book of Mark was written by a guy named Mark. I should have told you to sit down before I laid that one on you. I'm sorry. The book of Mark is written by a guy named Mark, but Peter is present in so many of the stories. A lot of people believe that Mark basically put his gospel together by interviewing Peter about his experiences with Jesus. So the book of Mark, very possibly, it's drawing on almost entirely Peter's memories of things that happened while he was with Jesus. And maybe there were other eyewitnesses that he interviewed also, other people who were there when these things happened. But it seems that Peter is the main source. And so this might have just been a historical detail that Peter remembered as he was telling the story. J. Warner Wallace, he's the author of Cold Case Christianity. And he drew upon his experience as a detective to talk about details like this that show up in the Gospels. He says when you're dealing with eyewitness testimony, sometimes you have bizarre details provided that don't really add anything to the story. They're just mentioned because it's things that happened. For example, I'll just give an example from my personal life. This is a totally true story. This happened to me a few months ago. So I work for a Christian media company. A couple of us were going out on an assignment, and we were meeting somebody. We were going to talk about this giant American flag that we have flying in our town. We were doing this video for Memorial Day. And so we're out there, we're recording the interview underneath this giant flag. And out of nowhere, this red car comes screeching around the corner. It's like driving at full speed. We're just in a quiet little neighborhood. And this car comes screeching around the corner and drives straight through a church parking lot, smashes right into a church that was about 50 or 100 yards away from us. Okay? Happened right in front of our eyes. Just totally random. Okay? I still don't really know what happened. My prediction, this was an old lady driving it, and I think that her accelerator got stuck like on the floor somehow, and maybe her foot got caught on it and she lost control. And so we went over, checked on her, called 911. She was okay. Emergency services showed up a little bit later, and they took care of things from there. We went back to making our video, and we just left them to deal with that. So I couldn't tell you what happened with the old lady and what happened with the church after that. Now, if I were to tell the story, kind of like how I just did, if I were to tell the story of how I went to film this video about the flag, I might include a line like, oh, and then an old lady crashed her car into the church next door. And, that story, that detail of the story, it really has nothing to do with the flag video. It has nothing to do with why we were out there that day. But I would mention it because, it was something that actually happened. It was kind of interesting and random and just bizarre. So, I would mention it even if it wasn't the main reason that we were out there. So I say all that to say this. The Gospels are full of little details, and they don't always contribute to the ongoing narrative. But they're there because the details are kind of interesting or because that's what stuck out in the memory of whoever was telling the story. And so when it comes to the four Gospels, remember that these are accounts of the memories of at least four people who saw these things or perhaps interviewed people who saw these things. John 21:24 says, "This is the disciple who is bearing witness about these things and who has written these things." So that's why John is including random details in his gospel, like how he got to the tomb first before Peter did as they were racing to it, or how they went fishing with Jesus after that and they caught 153 fish. Those little details, they might mean something, they might not. But those are the hallmarks of eyewitness testimony. This is one of the ways you can know you can trust the Bible, that it was written by people who actually saw these things, because they're including these little details of things that they remember. And so, as I said before, the book of Mark, it's probably very reliant on Peter's testimony. And you can start putting some of these parallel accounts side by side with each other, and it helps you gain a fuller picture of what happened. Like J. Warner Wallace says, when he was a detective, he would interview multiple witnesses. And sometimes their stories, they might not always line up perfectly by each other, but whenever you talk to everybody, you can paint a pretty clear picture of what happened. So perhaps Peter is telling Mark about the night that Jesus was arrested. And he says, we were all running away. Oh, and then there was this naked guy. And Mark says, whoa. What was that all about? And Peter says, I don't know. I don't have the slightest idea why he was naked. He's all wrapped up in a sheet. I just remember it happened. And so maybe Matthew's writing his gospel, and he's like, I didn't see no naked guy. I was running the other way. So Matthew didn't include that detail because he didn't see it. See, that's how eyewitness testimony works. In his book, The Reason for God, Tim Keller said, eyewitness accounts bear the marks of the natural, random, and circumstantial details that you expect to find in real testimony. N.T. Wright, he wrote a book called Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, and he said, this is a paraphrase, but he said, such details are often present because the authors were recounting real events as they remembered them. So my first theory today as to why a naked man appears in the middle of this story of Jesus' arrest, it's because this is an eyewitness testimony of a crazy random thing that actually happened. Now, I have a couple of additional theories that I would like to present to you, and they don't overrule the first theory that I've already given, okay? They're just maybe some additional ideas or insights that perhaps make a little sense of why this detail is included in Mark's gospel. So many scholars will throw out the idea that this is actually Mark himself who is making a personal appearance in his own book. The author of the book of Mark, he's also known in the Bible as John Mark. Maybe, I don't know, he thought maybe there were already too many Johns in the New Testament, so he would just go by Mark. In 1 Peter 5:13, it shows that Peter and John Mark, that they were well acquainted with each other. But we don't know exactly when Mark first became a follower of Jesus. So perhaps if he had an interaction with Jesus prior to the cross, this was a moment right here where his life intersected with an important moment in the story of Jesus. Tony Evans says in his commentary, some interpreters believe this to be a veiled reference by the author to himself. And I can't really explain much more than that, except I'll just say this is the most frequently cited theory. It's in all of my commentaries on Mark, okay? I think it's pure speculation, but it's in all of them. And it may explain why he included this detail. I mean, okay, Maybe he included it because it was something Peter actually remembered happening. But still, it's like, well, why include it when it doesn't seem to connect to anything else going on? Well, if it actually was Mark, this might explain why he mentioned it. Okay, now that doesn't explain why he's naked and wrapped up in a sheet, but it does explain why such a seemingly weird or irrelevant detail wasn't left on the cutting room floor. Perhaps John Mark was pulling a move from Quentin Tarantino or M. Night Shyamalan. He was including himself in a cameo in his own movie. But let's turn to a third theory, and this one is going to involve the element of this sheet, okay? A linen cloth, as it said. Well, it depends on what translation you use to know how it's described. The ESV for Mark 15:51, it said, "And a young man followed him with nothing but a linen cloth about his body." The NIV says a young man wearing nothing but a linen garment was following Jesus. So the word for linen cloth or garment right here in the Greek is the word sindon. And here's a definition of that word in a Greek dictionary. It says a linen cloth, especially that which was fine and costly, in which the bodies of the dead were wrapped. Okay, that is the definition for this word sindon. Something that you bury the dead in. Now, that's a very strange detail in an already strange encounter here in the Garden of Gethsemane. This word sindon, it's the same Greek word that is used when it speaks about the burial of Jesus not long after. If you look at Matthew 27:59, talking about Joseph of Arimathea here, it says, "And Joseph took the body and wrapped it in a clean linen shroud." The word sindon right there. The word sindon only appears a few other times in the New Testament. Every time that the word sindon shows up, it refers to burial cloths. So here's where it gets really weird. Why would there be a man who was present at the arrest of Jesus wrapped in burial cloths? Well, keep in mind something that I said before about how whenever you take several eyewitness accounts and you start layering them on top of each other, like how we have with the four Gospels, you can start to piece together the timeline in ways that you might not catch if you just heard from one of the witnesses. So there's a story that only appears in the Gospel of John. And this is actually my favorite chapter in the entire Bible. It's John 18. And it's where at the moment that they came to arrest Jesus, he said 2 words and he knocked 600 men on their butts. Not exaggerating at all. John 18, we'll look at verses 3-5. "So Judas, having procured a band of soldiers and some officers from the chief priests and the Pharisees, went there with lanterns and torches and weapons. Then Jesus, knowing all that would happen to him, came forward and said to them, 'Whom do you seek?' They answered him, 'Jesus of Nazareth.' Jesus said to them, 'I am he.'" So, right where we are in the story, okay, just like we were reading in Mark earlier, same incident. But I can't help but mention something here. In the Greek, when Jesus answered this question, he said, "I am he." Technically, that's not what he said. He actually just said 2 words. He said, "I am." Now, that is a powerful phrase. If you know your Old Testament, that is a powerful phrase. It brings back memories of God's identification of himself to Moses. When he said, "I am that I am," Moses was like, "Who should I say sent me? Like, what kind of God exactly are you?" And God says, "I am." That's all. It's a truly amazing answer. And Jesus had used it before as well. He said earlier in John, he said, "Before Abraham was, I am." I get goosebumps just saying it, guys. Right here, when these men come to arrest Jesus and they're led by Judas, this is how Jesus answers. There are 600 men right here. If you look at the other Gospels, there's 500 regular soldiers, 100 special forces soldiers. They've all come together, led by Judas, to arrest this one unarmed man who is standing in a garden and praying. Okay, and they all show up here, and Jesus said to them, "I am." And here's what happened next. John 18:6. Judas, who betrayed him, was standing with them. When Jesus said to them, "I am," they drew back and fell to the ground. It's Just an amazing scene to picture. 600 armed soldiers versus one unarmed guy, except that unarmed guy, he is God. And he says 2 words, and 600 men fall to the ground. Just imagine for a moment the power that must have been released from Jesus when he said those 2 words. The power to knock all those men to the ground. When I was talking to Bill last month in Colorado, he made the comment that whenever Jesus rose Lazarus from the dead, if you remember Jesus, he says into the tomb there, Lazarus, come out. And Bill remarked that perhaps if Jesus had not specified Lazarus specifically, perhaps every dead person in that tomb might have come walking out. And right here in the Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus was arrested, this garden is located at the bottom of the Mount of Olives. Now, the Mount of Olives was a major burial site for the Jews. It had tombs and graves all over it. And the reason was this was outside the city of Jerusalem, and they couldn't have those tombs and those graves inside the city limits because of the smell and all that, so they put it outside the city. And so there's tombs and graves all over this area. I'm going to throw this out there. This is pure speculation, okay? I'm just throwing it out there because it kind of makes sense of all these details. Perhaps when Jesus was approached by these men to be arrested, and he said, I am, and he released that power, perhaps there was a grave nearby where a young man had just been buried in a sindon, in a linen cloth. And perhaps that release of power from Jesus' mouth, that power that could knock hundreds of soldiers off their feet, perhaps that power caused this dead man to open his eyes and get out of that grave. And so he stumbles out of there in his grave clothes, and because listen, that was all he had on, that sheet basically wrapped around his naked body. And he's like, what's going on? He's confused about where he is. And all he knows is he heard somebody say, I am, and he woke up. And he looks over and he sees Jesus picking up a guy's ear and reattaching it to his head. And he walks over to understand what is going on in this crowd. And all of a sudden, they're arresting this miracle worker, and all of his buddies start running off. And then one of the soldiers there, he grabs you by the only thing you have on. And so you wiggle out of it and you run off into the night stark naked. Now, that's just a theory, but it's just something to think about that makes sense of a few of these details. And then here's a fourth theory. My fourth theory is that it's possible that everything I've said so far is correct. That this is a historical detail that was mentioned here only because Peter actually saw it and it actually happened, even if he didn't quite understand what was going on in the moment. But Jesus released that power and he rose someone from the dead right as he was about to head to his own death. And that this man in the linen cloth who came back to life, that man was perhaps even John Mark himself, who wrote the second gospel in your New Testament. Okay? I throw all these ideas out there to say you can do what you want with this information. But I think the fourth theory there that combines all of them, that's my favorite personally. So, okay, deep breath here. Next time on this podcast, I'm going to tackle a question that was sent in from Chris. There's been a theory that's been circulating online lately about the Apostle John. And so I'm going to tell you about it next time, and we're going to explore that theory. Make sure that you're subscribed so you can get that episode. What weird stuff in the Bible do you want to know more about? I'm doing a series right now on listener submitted questions. And so if you want to send one of your own, weirdstuffinthebible@gmail.com. I had a lot of great responses to my previous episode about why John 5:4 is not in the Bible. All 3 of them were YouTube comments. Gender4 says, your view is the most plausible in my mind. So thank you for that comment. And on that episode, kind of like today, I'm throwing out some ideas. You can accept whatever makes the most sense to you, take away from it, whatever you want. Larton Beats says, I also think that maybe people knew that the water would heal people after being stirred, but only the disciples of Jesus and him knew it was an angel. So the fact that it was an angel was revealed to the writer of John. I can imagine then asking what caused the water to stir, and Jesus telling them it was an angel. So, all right, perhaps so, Larton. And then Bryce, he had a long comment. I'm not going to read all of it for the sake of time. He says, verse 4 was most likely a side note that somebody wrote down so that when they shared this message with someone not in that particular culture, those people could understand. I don't believe verse 4 is divinely inspired, but it is helpful for us in the years after the event. So perhaps so, Bryce. I tend myself to just be very reluctant about saying that anything in my Bible was not divinely inspired. So that's why I didn't land on that view in that episode. But I know you have 100% good intentions in suggesting that and some good reasons to suggest it. I looked into all that stuff too when I was studying. And so anyway, I'm just saying why I hesitate to go there myself, because I'm like, if we start removing anything from the Bible and saying it's not divinely inspired, then that opens a whole can of worms for me that we could start removing all kinds of things from Scripture. So that's why I don't go all the way there, but I totally understand the argument for that position. Thank you to all three of you for those comments and some closing thoughts today on the naked man in the garden when Jesus was arrested. So many of you are familiar, I'm sure, with the fact that Jesus is called the second Adam in the New Testament. Jesus has a lot of parallels between his life and the life of Adam. For example, both had a test in a garden. Adam faced a small temptation and he failed his test. Jesus faced a huge temptation and he passed it. He said, not my will, but yours be done. So Jesus passed his test in the garden. Adam had an angel appear to ban him from the garden. Jesus had an angel appear to strengthen him in the garden. Adam's act of disobedience in the garden brought death to the whole world. Jesus' act of obedience in the garden brought life to the whole world. So we see all these parallels, and you could go on with more and more and more if you go beyond this story. Like Adam sinned because of a tree, Jesus died by paying for it on a tree. So there's so many things you could go into with all that. But in just sticking with this present context, something else I was thinking of as I was putting this together, in the Garden of Eden, there was a naked man. When God showed up, that man said, I realized I was naked, so I ran. And then the same thing, when Jesus was arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane, there was a naked man, and he ran off there too. And perhaps that parallel, that could also be a good reason to include this tiny, insignificant, weird little detail about the naked man who showed up for 2 verses at the arrest of Jesus. So when it comes to all these strange details that show up in the Gospels, remember that the Bible is not weird. We're weird because we don't understand how eyewitness testimony works. But now we do. Thanks for listening. God bless you for sticking around till the end. And we'll see you next time on Weird Stuff in the Bible.